Hi. So I want to continue today with our discussion of Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. Last time we were talking about the preface and the first chapter of the introduction called Sensation. And I want to pick up on one of the themes that I introduced there, the Merleau-Ponty introduced there, and that's what I want to focus on today, and it's the notion of the indeterminate. So you'll recall that he said on page 7, we must recognize the indeterminate as a positive phenomenon. I think that may be the first really powerful lesson in this book, one of the most powerful ones. It's quite a simple point, but it's huge in how significant it is in transforming our way of seeing and understanding things. So this I think, already there in those first few pages of the book, he's saying the thing that I think may affect your view more than almost anything else in the whole book. So I just want to dwell on it a bit. So the indeterminate is a positive phenomenon, right? So in other words, there is something intrinsic to that which we perceive that it is characterized by indeterminacy. Right, it's a positive phenomenon. It's not a negative description of a phenomenon. Right? It's not like you really see something but you fail to notice it. So indeterminacy isn't part of the phenomenon. It's something about your inattention or something like that. Right? That we're saying no, it's not that. It's a positive phenomenon in that the thing appears as indeterminate. Right? That's its very way of being present. Indeterminacy is constitutive of it or definitive of it. How is that so? Well, we saw it in a couple of ways. We first saw it in relationship to the basic notion of figure and background, right? And his point was that our perception always takes the form of the experience of a figure against a background, right? That's the form of perceptual experience. And so in any activity of perceiving, there is a background happening. A background is part of what is present. But what is present as a background is something that is present as indeterminate, right? So the first place we saw indeterminacy was in that idea that the very character of the background of our perceptual experience is that it doesn't have a fully resolved form, and that comes up in a few different ways. Right, it comes up in the sense that the sort of visually speaking with the white dot against something else or whatever, that the stuff behind the figure is kind of blurry and vague. Well, that's a kind of indeterminacy. It's a very important kind, and that's a little bit like what he says on page 6 when he says the region surrounding the visual field is not easy to describe. Like he's talking about peripheral vision, like if you move your hand out, like when do you start to see it? And he's saying there isn't a clearly identifiable point where it goes from not being seen to being seen, right? That's what he's talking about. He says the region surrounding the visual field is not easy to describe, but it is certainly neither black nor gray. In this region, there is an indeterminate vision, a vision of something or other. So that's kind of like the idea of the background in any little image or any little perceptual experience, right? There's a domain where there's something being perceived there, but it's being sort of perceived on the side, and you could turn your attention to it and figure out what it is explicitly. But then it wouldn't be the same experience anymore. And in doing that, something else would have now fallen into that same state, right? So in your perception, there is always a dimension of something, the very nature of which is that it doesn't rise to, you might say, full presence. It's present, but it's kind of ambiguously present, right? And so I guess another way to put this same point is that he's disputing the idea that anything simply is either present or absent, as if those were kind of absolute terms, right? On the contrary, there are dimensions of absence that are an ambiguity and not full presence that are characterizing presence, what's present all the time, and indeed, even what is absent can have a kind of presence. This is again an example, I mentioned it the last time, an example Sartre gives of seeing someone's absence. You go to look for Pierre, and it's actually Pierre's absence that presents itself. That's quite an interesting point. But there are other ways you can see that too. So, look, for example, at this image of a dinosaur, right? This is a dinosaur against a wall, and so on. And the thing is, you see the dinosaur as being against, or as being set against a wall. You're not looking at the wall, you're looking at the dinosaur. But the point is, you can even look at the wall if you like. Like it's not that you have to let it sink into the background. Look at the wall if you like. The point is, you see the wall as continuing behind the dinosaur. Right? There are no parts of this picture where the wall behind the dinosaur is being put on display, right? And yet, you see the wall as a uniform, continuous thing behind the dinosaur, and you see the dinosaur as obstructing your view of that wall, right? You see the non-visible wall, so to speak. You see it as there, even though it's not, sending any sense impressions at you or something like that, right? So there, something that in what somebody might think is a strict sense, they would say that's invisible, but there's a way in which it's visible, right? And Merleau-Ponty makes that same point right after what I read before. He says, in this region, there's an indeterminate vision, a vision of something or other, and if taken to the extreme, that which is behind my back is not without visual presence, right? So he's saying, actually, if we honestly describe the form our experience takes, there's a way in which that which is behind us, it is part of what we experience as presented to us in this scene, analogously to the way that what's behind the dinosaur is something you see as being there. Right? It has a kind of presence in your experience, even though you might say in a strict sense it's absent from that experience. Right? So what I'm getting at there is what I was saying a minute before, that the rigid and clear separation of presence and absence is what he's challenging. It's not the case in our perceptual world that it is simply the case that something either is present or it is absent. There are all kinds of degrees of presence and absence, and the very character of what is presented is that it is a kind of it involves both of those things, and there's a mixture of clarity and ambiguity, etc., etc. And specifically then the terms I'm after, determinacy and indeterminacy. Anyway, so I wanted to say that first, just to go through those examples and remind you a little bit of where he's saying indeterminacy happens, and we talked about it with the figure and background. I want to go back now to that other example he gives, which comes right after that, which is the Mueller-Lyer illusion, right? So in the Mueller-Lyer so-called illusion, he says, well, the reason you think it's an illusion is because if you bring out a ruler, you'll see that those two central horizontal lines are quantitatively identical. They're exactly the same length, mathematically speaking. And yet perceptually, one of them looks sort of short and the other one looks long, right? They don't look like they're the same at all. And he's saying there, it's not really an illusion. You only call it an illusion if you think, if you start off by saying, well, they really are the same length, but you're sort of misseeing them because of this and that. And he's saying it really, perceptually speaking, you should talk about this somewhat differently. That he's saying each of those figures, the line with the arrowheads pointing in and the line with the arrowheads pointing out, those figures are each kind of local, right? Each of them defines kind of its own meaningful world. And the thing that's indeterminate there is the shared relationship between them, right? That each of them is kind of internally defined but not externally defined. And in your perception of each of them, the question isn't asked, what is the quantity of this length in relationship to the quantity of that other length? Right? That you can have that relationship. You can pull out a ruler and measure those things and so on. Right? That is an experience of those things that is available to you. You can get it out of that. But that's not the form in which you see it. The form in which you see it is that your perception recognizes two kind of local groupings with their own integrity. And perceptually, the question is not asked how those things measure up against some further grid. The grid of uniform measurement, quantitative measurement, in relationship to which you would say that those two central lines are equal in length, is not itself a dimension of your immediate perceptual experience. So that dimension of possible comparison is indeterminate. That's the thing in that domain that's indeterminate. And so I wanted you to get out this idea then that indeterminacy doesn't just mean the background is blurry. It also means that there are all kinds of potential dimensions of meaning, of meaningfulness, that are left unspecified in your perceptual life. Sometimes you can, just as you can turn and look at the background that used to be sort of blurry and it becomes clear, just as you can turn to that and bring it to determinacy, so are there other implicit dimensions of potential meaningfulness that you can shift from indeterminacy to determinateness. That's a thing you can do to your perception. But in your perceiving in the immediate form in which it happens, those issues are indeterminate. And so now that's there. I'm just going back over the things we already looked at last time, and maybe bring out a little bit more. But I want to move on now to push a little bit further with this notion I've just been bringing out about the sort of internal integrity of those two sort of local realities, the two lines on the Mueller-Lyre image, where the broader universe of potential comparison of those things, where you would treat them as instances of the same type of stuff or whatever, where that question is not asked. I want to pursue that a little bit further, and I want to pursue that a little bit further by referring to the notion of a thing. Right? Because these, you get these lines, these color patches and so on. You might see the point there, but it can seem quite abstract, and it might take a little bit of work to think how you're going to turn that into your looking at people playing on the ground, on the street or whatever, right? Well, so I want to try to do that. I want to bring up the notion of thing. And the basic point I want to make is things are like those lines with arrowheads in the Mueller-Lyre picture, right? Things, whether it's the upright bass across from me in the room, or my cat who went missing a couple of weeks ago and probably is never going to be seen again, or a person. I want you to think about things as similar kinds of local realities, local zones of integrity that in a way kind of internally define their own universe that is not automatically in communication with the universe of other things. And so another way of saying that bit about sort of internal zones of integrity and so on is to call them wholes. Right? And so you could say that about the things in the Mueller-Lyre picture. Each of them is a kind of whole. And rather than being just assemblages of independently defined line segments, perceptually what there is first is the whole. And every one of those things you would call a line segment perceptually is more like a property of that whole. And so all of the in these things, I guess there are 5 line segments, right? The 2 halves of each arrowhead and the horizontal line. each of those 5 segments perceptually in a way says the same thing. In the case of the one, I guess it says something like compressed. In the case of the other, it says something like expanded. I'm not sure what word you would put to it, but your perception through all of them is of the expression of that whole meaning, right? And that's why he said at one point in perceptual life, the issue is more of an expressive value rather than a logical signification. Right? That's really what you're getting here when you see that thing we could call a line segment. What you immediately perceive is something more like an expressive value. That sense of compactness or that sense of elongation, something like that, is what is presented to you through that element or that feature of the whole. But you know, if you just draw a line segment by itself, uncontextualized by the rest of that figure, well, it wouldn't say that, right? Then you might just measure it and say, oh, it's a 2 centimeter segment or whatever. But that's not what you see immediately when you get this image, right? So what I'm trying to bring out there then is that relationship, what it means to be a whole, and the relationship of property and whole, where or maybe I should say part and whole, that the when you are relating to a whole, every part bespeaks that larger unity. Right? So anyway, so that's what we could say about those images. Well, I want to say that's how we should think about things. When you see the base, when you see a cat, when you see a person, you see and it. There's one thing there, one single individual. And you see it as a whole. You see it as a kind of singularity. It's just that unique thing. Right? And perceptually, all the different parts of it express that same thing. So that's what I want to talk about. And I'm going to read you another little quotation. This is not from the beginning of chapter 2, and I'm going to read a couple of bits from chapter 2. But this is from page 16 of Don Landis's translation. And this is in the section called The Segregation of the Field. And he says, our perceptual field is made of things and gaps between things. In other words, again, if you go back to, I mean, you can recognize this in your own perceptual experience, but you could also see this documented in, all the surveys and whatever else that the Gestalt psychologists did. This is how people describe the form in which their perceptual life actually happens, right? Our perceptual field is articulated as things and the gaps between them. And interestingly, roughly speaking, one of those is figure and one of those is background. That is to say, we see the things and the gaps, which we sometimes misleadingly call space. I'll tell you why, and I can clarify the misleading aspect of that in a moment. But the gaps we don't really typically see as such. We typically see the things. You can play this little game on yourself. You can say, okay, I'm going to try to see the gaps between things. But that, as he says in these pages, like involves really quite a dramatic reorientation of your perceptual relationship to this, right? You're basically switching from figure and background, from figure to background. Why did I say it was misleading? Just because, yeah, you can use space in this kind of loose way of saying it's where there aren't things, but of course there's stuff there. There's air there, or there's smoke, or there's whatever, right? It just happens to be transparent. Right, and so if by space you mean that larger domain or larger context of sort of placement, that grid within which things are placed, then the gaps between things are no more space than so what we're calling here the gaps between things are no more space than are the things themselves. On the contrary, all of those things we're talking about occupy space. And space then is not one of the things. Like, it's not like there are things and then there's some space between them, even though idiomatically that's how we speak. Rather, space is that pervasive and universal context, which is the where all these the awareness of with respect to which all things are situated, right? And so, as Husserl says in another context, in his lectures on thing and space, he says space is actually something you would say is co-perceived with things, right? You see space in seeing things. There isn't some separate perceptual act that would involve seeing space. I'm not going to dwell on that. It might become relevant to us later. But I wanted to mention that to you now just because I wanted you to, well, I guess because I want to encourage you to be a little more careful and a little more thoughtful in relating to how you talk about your own perception. And so, yeah, so I'm just trying then to really pick up on this line that our perceptual field is segregated into things and gaps between things. And those things, he says a little bit later, I see as things certain wholes, right? And that's the notion I was trying to talk about before with the Mueller-Lyre business and so on, right? That the logical relationship of whole and part, as opposed to sum and aggregated element, right? But whole and part has that notion of integrity built into it, right? That notion of whole is the notion we need to employ when we're going to talk about things. So let's do that now. Let's talk a little bit more about the perception of some things. So I want to start with again one little quotation from chapter 1 again. He says on page 11. I can become familiar with a person's face without ever having perceived for itself the color of the eyes. I can attest to that. That's a really striking experience in my life. My color perception is just fine. I can look at people and see, do you have green eyes or blue eyes or whatever, and I can see that, right? But there are many people that I have known for years, and I have no idea what color their eyes are. That makes me a little bit unusual, I think, just based on my experience of others, in that it seems pretty common that people do come to recognize people's eye color and so on. But even though I am maybe a little unusual in mostly never getting around to noticing that, basically anybody has that experience sometime, right? And because perceptually what you see as a whole, you see a face, and that face has a kind of overall expressive meaning, a kind of identity. And that's what you see through the nose, it's what you see through the eyes, it's what you see through the ears, through the eyebrows, through everything else. You might sometimes notice a salient feature, that's fine. But overall, you're seeing a kind of singular, total meaning. And that same thing is what is communicated to you through all of those dimensions. Or let me say it a little bit differently what I mean by that. That's what you see when you see each of those dimensions. You see that identity being presented to you. Right? To see the line segment in the Mueller-Lyre picture as having a quantity of length, quantity of centimeters, right, is to have crippled, to have killed, to have got rid of your sort of normal and immediate perceptual experience, and to have dismembered the normal vision you have of those lines with arrowheads, and sort of like a surgeon gone in with a scalpel and isolated a little piece of that so that you could put a ruler up against it, right? You actually have to not see the context in order to be able to measure it, basically. You have to, change the context of that line segment from part of an image to instance of universally measurable length, right? So they both have context, but both ways of treating it have a context. You just have a different one, right? Well, similarly here, you have to perform a little bit of surgery to see eye color, or to see the shape of a nose, or to see even hair color, hair length, hairstyle, whatever. You can do that. You can take anybody's face and you can look at it differently, analytically, to see, I wonder what color your eyes are, right? But to look and say, I wonder what color your eyes are, you have to actually change the perspective you had. And that example with the face, I think we're familiar with that in a bigger way too, right? Like, just think about what it is to see another person as a person / as a body, right? You can be, the classic sort of example of this would be the, lecherous man goes around, looking at all the women who go by, with a ruler in the back of his eyes, essentially, measuring that woman's different body parts, right? So, that's a classic reality, a thing that happens in our culture, right? There's this particular gaze, this evaluative gaze of men that treats women's bodies, first of all, as objects, right? You don't see a person coming at you, you see a certain kind of object, and then you treat that object itself as just a compilation of different sorts of parts, and you think, oh, it's got that part, and I like the size and shape of that one, I don't like the size and shape of that part, or whatever, right? So of course that people do perceive things that way, but remember also that people don't like to be perceived that way. I mean, some people might sometimes, but I mean, overall, that's a way of perceiving that we're critical of, right? We say that there's something troubling about seeing a person as an object, and there's something troubling about seeing a woman's body as a compilation of sort of independently defined parts, and so you think, well, what is it that you'd want to see instead? Well, you'd want to see a person, and you'd want to see the identity of that person communicated through the entirety of that person's body. And the fact is, if you didn't have this weird, distorted male gaze that people, grow up into and learn how to do and so on, that would be how you would see people. Or another way of saying that is, that's the normal way we see people. The thing you see first, typically, if you have a sort of basic perception, is a person. And a person, like those arrow-headed lines in the Mueller-Lyer picture, doesn't actually have parts that are really comparable to the parts of another person, right? The arms and legs and eyes and whatever else of a person are all the ways in which that single whole shows itself, and another person shows themselves through their parts. And in the normal immediate perception of a person, you don't have sort of surgically isolated elements that stand in mathematical comparison to the comparable surgically isolated elements of the other person's body. You might think of another example of that, maybe where it's even clearer, and that's at the level of touch, right? In your sort of experience of your own body, right? If somebody reaches out and touches my shoulder, they touch me. If somebody reaches out and touches my cheek, they touch me. If shake hands, they touch my hand, they touch me, right? It's not like there's me somewhere and then there are all these pieces, but there is a single sort of experiential reality of being me that pervades my whole body, and anywhere you touch that same thing, that me. That's a kind of holism sort of from the inside. Well, my point is that in perceiving another, there's something very similar that happens, right? That person, the identity of that person, is what you see throughout the whole thing. But of course, you can analyze, you can adopt an analytical perspective. Analyze, which is to say, cut loose, separate out from one another all the different parts, and then treat them as isolated realities that can be compared on some uniform, universal grid to the isolated parts of another person. But like the two lines in the Mueller-Lyer picture, that's not our starting point perceptually when we see people. we first see a person, and it's only against the context of having seen that person that the dividing up, the noticing of isolated features will start to happen. Okay, so I want to. I hope that's clear enough as a way then of bringing out. I mean, I chose a person, but we could say that same thing about the upright bass or the dog or the cat or whatever else, right? So I hope I've made it clear enough there how those kinds of lessons, ideas about indeterminacy in relationship to the figure and background in the Mueller-Lyre picture pertain to these, regular aspects of our perception all the time, right? And the point I really want to bring out of that is that, perceptually speaking, then, if we go back just to his example about you see a person's face and you don't recognize the color of their eyes, right? The eyes of the perceptual object don't automatically come with the quality blue, right? Blue is not automatically given as the color of that perceived eye in experience. You can see blue there if you make it the figure of your perception and let the rest of the visage slip into the background. No longer notice the face you're looking at, but let that be this kind of indeterminate context for the isolation of a perception of a colored eyeball, right? But normally you see a face, and in that case, that sort of qualitative, what you would think of as the qualities of color and shape and so on, that turns into a certain kind of indeterminacy, right? So the point I want to make there then is, remember, Merleau-Ponty initially brought this up in the section of the sensation chapter where he was talking about the idea of sensation as a quality. And he says what happens is, since we believe things in the world have qualities, we presume that we must see qualities, right? And so he says people treat sensation as a quality by taking the character of the object and saying, well, that must be what's there in perception. The point of this description is that that's perceptually false, right? The eyes of the face that I perceive typically are perceptually indeterminate with respect to color, right? They're qualitatively indeterminate, not determinate, right? We can make them determinate. That is to say, we can have a perception of a determinate color of the eye, but that involves a new perceptual experience. It involves a transformation of the perceptual experience we had before. Right? Remember, he said around that point that the empiricist might say that that's just because you weren't paying attention, and he said that we're going to go see that attention isn't actually really that compelling a notion, and this is what he brings up in chapter 3. And so I want to just take you to page 32 in chapter 3, because there he says. He's been talking about on page 32. He's been talking about when children develop color perception, and again based on various experiments and so on. He's saying that the color perception sort of goes through stages from a perceptual field where the color is sort of differentiated only according to certain axes to a richer differentiation, but it's not just a quantitative increase, it's a radically different kind of differentiation of the field. And so he's saying that when a child really gets to that point of seeing the colors that we say, normal, healthy adult human perception sees, that's a Gestalt shift, right? That's a radically new organization of the perceptual field and so on, right? And so he says, the first perception of colors, properly so called, is thus a change in the structure of consciousness, the institution of a new dimension of experience, and the development of an a priori. We don't have to worry about that part, but it's the next part I want to get at. So he says, attention then must be conceived on the model of these originary acts, since a second-order attention that limited itself to recalling an already acquired knowledge would refer us back to the acquisition itself. So in other words, to pay attention is not merely to further clarify some pre-existing givens. Rather, it is to realize in them a new articulation by taking them as figures. They are only preformed as horizons. They truly constitute new regions in the total world. The original structure that they introduce is precisely what makes the identity of the object before and after the act of attention appear. Right? So that's a long quotation. The point I would just want to make there is that he's saying when you pay attention, as in this example of saying you pay attention to the color of the eyes, somebody might say, oh, you were already seeing it, you just weren't paying attention. He's saying that's not what it's like. There can be situations that are like that, where you already have a whole bunch of stuff established and you choose to ignore this in order to look at this or whatever, right? There is a reality of a phenomenon of choosing to focus on this rather than that and so on. But he's saying, that's what he's calling second order attention. He's saying that's not what's happening when you're noticing the color of the eyes. He's saying that's first order attention. That's a kind of originary act, because you are taking it as a figure where it was previously only, prefigured as a horizon. And by a horizon, he means, a domain where you're not there yet, but you could go over there and explore it. Right? Well, in your perception of the face, it is given as something you could look more deeply into, right? There is the indeterminacy that characterizes those dimensions isn't nothing. It's like this bubbling or sort of pregnant dimension of your experience that's always there, sort of saying, you could look over here. Do you want to see what's down here? You're sort of invited by your perception to explore things you haven't yet explored. But when you do it, you bring into being something new. Right, and so he's saying attention then is not properly understood when it's understood just as a kind of searchlight that sort of spotlights something that was already there. You really have to understand it, on the contrary, as an originative activity that transforms the experience. And in fact, let me read you one more thing about that searchlight. This is page 28 and then 29. Yeah, he says, he's talking about the way, empiricism says, the average sort of empiricist view says, well, everything must be there. And then when perceptual experience shows that the thing they said must be there wasn't there, they say, oh, you must not have been paying attention, right? So that's why he says, attention actually is introduced theoretically not because it's a correct description of our experience, but because it's trying to compensate. It's a sort of auxiliary hypothesis meant to compensate for the fact that the theory doesn't initially account for the experience, for the evidence, and so they say, okay, this must explain it, right? So he says that's where that notion comes from, and he says attention in that context is imagined to be like a spotlight illuminating pre-existing objects hidden in the shadows, right? But what he says on the contrary is well, we've seen what he's going to say on the contrary, but I want to read you one other thing. He says, we're going to have to show, this is on page 29, how a perception awakens attention, and then how attention develops and enriches this perception. An internal connection would need to be described. And so the thing he wants to get at there, then, is that really what's happening with attention is not there's an already given determinate thing, and then this already given determinate light that somehow freely and independently deploys itself against this alien object and, sees what's there. Rather, the relationship between what we might more properly designate with that name and that which it shows up is something more like question and answer or solicitation and response or something like that. Right? There's something drawing you to look at it. And as you look at it, you bring it to a kind of resolution. And so there's both the attention isn't neutral, it's responding to a call, and it also doesn't do nothing. It allows that potential perceptual object to be developed into its kind of into perceptual richness and fullness, right? And that's what he's referring to then as a kind of internal connection between them. So Okay, so I want to take those ideas now, and I want to now look at one more example he gives, just to bring a little bit more these issues of the indeterminacy of quality, and especially this issue of the indeterminacy of relations and so on. So let's look at an example that he gives on pages 17 and 18. So he says, if I am walking on a beach toward a boat that has run aground, and if the funnel or the mast merges with the forest that borders the dune, then there will be a moment in which these details suddenly reunite with the boat and become welded to it. As I approached, I did not perceive the resemblances or the proximities that were, in the end, about to reunite with the superstructure of the ship in an unbroken picture. I merely felt that the appearance of the object was about to change, and something was imminent in this tension, as the storm is imminent in the clouds. The spectacle was suddenly reorganized, satisfying my vague expectation. Afterward, I recognized, as justifications for the change, the resemblance and the contiguity of what I call stimuli, that is, the most determinate phenomena obtained from up close and with which I compose the true world. How did I not see that those pieces of wood were part of the boat? They were, after all, the same color as the boat, and they match its superstructure perfectly. But these reasons, drawn from having properly perceived the boat, were not given as reasons prior to correct perception. Right, so that's a very interesting example, I think. And I trust it's a pretty familiar one. Maybe not with the ship exactly, but with things like that, right? In this case, you're walking down the beach and you see something and you kind of think, what's that? You see something and you know that there is something to be seen there. Or maybe I shouldn't say you know. You perceive, you sense that there is something to be seen there, but you can't tell what it is. Something isn't quite right, and so that's what he means when you have a kind of vague presentiment of something that's coming, right? So there's a little bit of a sort of discomfort in your perception, like that's not quite the way it is, and you might even try to figure out, is it this, or is it that? But there's a thing that happens, right? There's a Gestalt shift, right? Suddenly, you see, oh, it's a ship with its mast caught in the trees, right? Or something like that, right? So what happens then is, you see things clearly. You see clearly a ship. You see clearly the trees in which it's caught, and so on, and then when you can see that clear whole, you recognize all the relevant parts of that ship as, in terms of how they fit into the ship. Like it makes sense, like, if I'm looking at the upright base in a similar circumstance, I would say, oh, that's the neck of the base. Oh, those were the strings. Oh, that's the tuning pegs. That's the headstock, whatever, the bridge, right? So you see those parts of the boat in terms of their functional relationship to that thing as a whole. So that's the description of that's the phenomenological description of the experience, right? And I trust you've had experiences like that, right, where you see something, but the something you see is kind of indeterminate, like you can't make sense of it, and you have a sense that there is something clear to be seen there, but you don't yet know what it is. And then it changes, and that change is a kind of a sudden thing. Right? Now he wants to make a couple of points here. So he says, what often happens after that is once you've seen it, you say, oh, why didn't I see that before? Because now that you've seen the thing and you see the clear relationships between all the different parts, they seem so obvious. You think, well, they were there before. Why didn't I notice that? There's actually an interesting similar thing that happens in teaching, right? When the teacher understands a point, like especially, let's say someone's studying philosophy, or, it could be anything, could be math or whatever, but certainly it's clear, significant with philosophy. Once you've understood the thing, you see why the author said this here and this here and this here in the book. Right? And teachers often don't grasp the way that the student reading the book who doesn't already understand it doesn't see that those parts are sort of fitting together to do something. And, really the job of the teacher is to get someone to take this book, which seems a little bit like mud, and get them to the point where, having understood the point, they can now see the ordered way it was already put together, right? And the interesting thing about books is, probably like a philosophy book, probably the author has tried to put it together in an ordered way to let you go step by step to see the point. But nonetheless, like when you're studying those things for the first time, they're often not clear in that way at all. And so, just like the person who has seen the boat now says, like, why didn't I see that before? Similarly, teachers can say to students, why didn't you see that? Didn't you see he said this here and this here and this here? And like, students can sort of say, yeah, but I saw that, but I didn't realize what sort of significance they had. Anyway, the point Merleau-Ponty is making is that the person who says that after seeing the boat, like the teacher, is really failing to recognize honestly and accurately what, in this case, the person seeing the boat, what his or her or their experience was like just seconds ago. In case of the teacher, what the student's experience is like, right? That for you, when you were walking down the beach, those things you saw, going back to what we were talking about before, didn't have all those kinds of determinate qualities that our later perception takes to be their obvious given features. And for that same reason, sort of what you're seeing over here wasn't given in your perception as to be related to what's going on down here and what's going on over here, right? The qualities of the different elements and their relationships are both at that point indeterminate. After the fact, those things all seem clear, and so we retrospectively insist that they must have been clear before, right? But phenomenologically speaking, that's not the case, right? And so let me now read another remark from that. This is right before where it started. He says, right at the beginning of that paragraph in the bottom of 17, if we hold ourselves to phenomena, right, to the form in which things actually appear in our experience, then the unity of the thing in perception is not constructed through association, but rather, being the condition of association, this unity precedes the cross-checkings that verify and determine it. This unity precedes itself. Right, so the point there is, going back to this talk about sensory quality and so on, if you read someone like Hume, he says you got your sense impressions, ideas and impressions and so on. And he's wondering, how we go from the data of immediate sensory life to the recognition through those data that we're seeing this thing, and this thing, right? So, I'm not interested here in the rigorous interpretation of Hume's texts, which may be more subtle than they're often given credit for. All I'm interested in is this basic idea that's usually associated with Hume, that what we are actually perceiving are these sensory qualities, right? The very position Merleau-Ponty has been criticizing, and that what has to happen in our experience is that we have to associate those things according to resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. We have to associate those things to construct in our experience our beliefs about what we're encountering, right? So that the question is, how do we associate ideas? Well, we connect them based on resemblances, and because we see certain things are like one another, we put them together, and that's how we come to conclude that there's a dog there or something like that, right? And so Merleau-Ponty's that's basically the thing he's criticizing in this second chapter about the association of ideas. He's saying that. First of all, we never go through that process of constructing, right? It's phenomenologically false to say that we ever have that experience of an isolated quality. We talked about that already. And it's phenomenologically false to say that our experience takes the form of us associating them. We don't do anything, right? In the case of seeing the ship, right, suddenly there's a Gestalt shift and you see this thing. Right? And so Merleau-Ponty's saying there that in our perception, things have associated themselves and they present themselves in relation as having that meaning. Right? It's not something we do. The relation is something we perceive, but it's not something that you can perceive from isolated sensory qualities, because the relationships precisely are that meaningfulness of the whole. Right? So the experience prior to recognizing that whole doesn't have a bunch of determinate qualities floating around that you could then look at and compare, see similarities and associate. Right? The relevant kinds of association already presuppose that you've recognized what kind of thing you're looking at. Right? And so his point is that the association of things comes from the way that they carry the significance of belonging together in something. And so it's by experiencing first that in which they belong that the characteristic, let's say, of being like each other, of resembling each other, of being connected to each other, becomes something sort of perceptible, something sort of discernible within that which you've already perceived. That was the point, basically, with the Mueller lines, right? And I just want to read one more line from that, and this is the line right at the end. So this is then kind of the sort of summary description of what actually happens. He says, the unity of the object, in the case of going up to see the boat on the beach, the unity of the object is established upon the presentiment of an immanent order that will suddenly respond to questions that were merely latent in the landscape. Right. So the point then that I want to make there is that, going back to what I was saying about attention, right, that the experience of recognition is really, of recognizing something, some kind of identity, is really an experience of involvement and interaction, something like a dialogue, right? It's the perception of something that sort of speaks to you, and it speaks to you by sort of posing a problem to you and saying that, there's something you're supposed to see here, but you're not getting it. And, it draws your attention. That's an idiom we use. And I mean, he's saying that's more or less true phenomenologically, that we experience the object as drawing our attention. We don't sit back and just survey things with a searchlight. There are circumstances in which that happens, but that's not the normal situation. We experience ourselves as drawn by something in the object that solicits our attention. And it's on the basis of that we, bring a kind of responsive engagement with it that lets this thing appear. Right? And so that's much more the model of what the activity of perception is like than the familiar model, either of a searchlight looking down on things, or someone constructing interpretations based on data, associations, and so on. Okay, so I want to give that example because I think it's quite a good one. I think there's so much you can, so many things you can remember, or so much you can recognize in that example. But I want to now stop that account, basically, of the attempt to describe our perception. We did it last time, and what I did this time was try to bring out of that the inherent place of indeterminacy in that, and the relationship between that and this sort of reinterpretation of what we might call attention, and the relationship of all of those things to the structure of figure and ground and so on. I want to stop that account and then look at one further part of his story, which especially was back in the preceding chapter on sensation, which is the question of why do we get it wrong? Right? Where does that account of sensation come from? And his basic answer is it comes from physiology, right? Because based on our studies of the world, we have a view, we have theories about the causal order of things and how things relate. And so we think, they have to relate this way. That means this must be what's happening in perception. Right? And so that's what he wants to talk about now. In fact, he's going to talk about that to a significant degree throughout the whole book. But I want to look just at a few things he says back earlier in the chapter on sensation. So let me first just give you a little quotation. well, reasonably long quotation. This is from page 7, back in the first chapter. He says, although we, just repeating the question I was just asking, although we have no experience of sensation, do we at least find some reasons in its causes and in its objective genesis to maintain it as an explanatory concept? Well, physiology, to which the psychologist turns as if to a higher authority, is in the same predicament as psychology, because it too begins by situating its object in the world and by treating it as a fragment of extension. They lose sight of behavior by focusing on the reflex. So we're going to go on to talk a little bit about what's called reflex arc theory. He's going to mention that in a minute. I just want to bring out these two words, behavior and reflex. Basically, what he's going to say is that physiological analyses interpret behavior on the model of reflex, and what he's going to insist on the contrary is that we would need to interpret reflex on the model of behavior. He has an earlier book prior to the Phenomenology of Perception called The Structure of Behavior, and that's one of the first points in that book is that the reflex has to be understood as a kind of behavior. You'll see what I mean by that in a minute. But anyway, I just want to underline those two words. Anyway, they lose sight of behavior by focusing on the reflex. That is the elaboration and the formulation of stimuli. Behavior is hidden by a longitudinal theory of nervous functioning that makes each element of the reaction correspond in principle to an element of the situation. As in reflex arc theory, the physiology of perception begins by assuming an anatomical trajectory that leads from a determinate receiver through a definite transmitter to a recording post, which is itself specialized. The objective world being given, it is assumed that the world confides messages to the sense organs that thus must be carried and then decoded in such a way as to reproduce in us the original text. From this it follows that there is in principle a point-by-point correspondence and a constant connection between the stimulus and the elementary perception. But this constancy hypothesis enters into conflict with the givens of consciousness. Obviously a long quotation. But basically what he's saying there is we're all familiar with a kind of physiological model that says something stimulates you that through some mechanism affects something in your brain which sends a reverse message back that makes you move. Right. That's roughly the reflex arc theory. Stimulation, sort of translation, reaction. And he calls that a constancy hypothesis because he's saying this is based on the idea that you can sort of determinately trace back from what ends up happening step by step, a perfect line of deterministic causality back to the thing that started it. So that everything that happens has this kind of direct correlate in some sort of physiological causal structure. So that's roughly the reflex arc theory that he's talking about, and roughly what he means by the constancy hypothesis. I'm not going to go through all the things he says in detail, but I think I can make the basic points clear enough. In fact, let me mention one other thing. There's a great essay by John Dewey called The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology, or something quite close to that, from, I believe, 1896. It's a really great article. It's quite short. And basically, 50 years before Merleau-Ponty published this book, Dewey said the same thing. So I highly recommend that essay to anybody who's studying this book, because Dewey really says quite nicely the thing Merleau-Ponty is trying to get at here. So I'm going to say a couple of things based on a couple of points Dewey makes, because I think that's sort of a helpful way into this point. So Dewey says the reflex arc theory has something quite great about it, because it's really built around recognizing a kind of communication between sensation and movement, right? It's saying that the things that happen are sensory motor, right? They're a kind of linking of these two quite distinct modalities, what you might think of as quite distinct modalities of our experience, insofar as sensation we think of as a matter of consciousness. Motor things are relationship of the body. So the the virtue of the reflex arc theory is that it's working with a kind of overcoming of the dualism of mind and body, a theme that will come up again often, by taking these two realms that we might otherwise think of as inherently incapable of communicating, and saying, oh, no, this is a sensory motor phenomenon, the reflex. So Dewey says, that's the great thing about it. That's its promise. But his complaint about it is that though it kind of announces that as what it's doing, in the way it's carried out, it really just reproduces the same old dualisms, and that's Merleau-Ponty's point as well. And so Dewey says, he gives an example of this. He says, think about what you might think of as a reflex. You might think of a reflex as being drawn to a light, to look at a light, or letting your hand go when you feel a hot burning thing. He says, he takes an example. The example of a child, reaching out to a candle, getting burned, and letting go. And he says, there's a way that whole thing, someone can try to account for that as reflexes. So the child's just there, it sees the light, it's drawn to it, it grabs it, it gets burned, it turns away. That whole thing looks like just kind of automatic behavior, right? There it seems like you would have this really great example of something that's really just determined behind your back without anything else going on. And partially that would be a reflection of the way that children, do those things sort of automatically, it seems, right? And Dewey says, the way the physiologists tend to take this up is a series of isolatable, discrete acts, that this thing happens, this thing happens, this thing happens, causality being pushed along. And he, like Dewey, like Merleau-Ponty, says on the contrary, you really need to understand this as a single act of perception, very much in the way Merleau-Ponty talks about the ship and so on. And Dewey says what's really happening is that the child, not just the hand or something, but really the child, who's situated in the world with all kinds of other things going on and so on, the child is responding to not so much the mechanical effect of some stimulation, some stimulus, etc., that has a direct causal effect and some reaction and so on, but more like what Merleau-Ponty says about the vague presentiment of something with the ship on the beach. The something is drawing the child, and the child's action is a little bit more like the act of attention. It's in the sense Merleau-Ponty was talking about. It's this sort of call and response. And Dewey says the child is doing something which is responding meaningfully to a kind of solicitation from the environment, such that the burn is really the first act of seeing, or the first act of perceiving, right? So the reflex arc thing has introduced this notion of sensation or whatever, and has had, determinate thing does determinate thing does determinate thing does determinate thing. Dewey says really you need to recognize the experience of getting burned as, analogously to Merleau-Ponty's example, the moment of suddenly seeing the ship, right? It's in being burned that an otherwise unresolved but kind of beckoning situation is brought to clarity. And, that the hand moves away because that's the appropriate way to complete the experience. But so what Dewey says is the key is to understand that whole process of what the child does as a single perceptual activity. Right, that the act of perceiving has a process and it takes time, and it goes through this inauguration, this resolution, and this completion. It's not a series of isolated, discrete, separate events. And anyway, I highly recommend that essay. It's great. But I think that basic contrast, if that makes sense, is really the point that Merleau-Ponty wants to make. And so when people talk about reflexes, they often talk about them as strictly automatic, strictly mechanical. And Merleau-Ponty and Dewey really want to try to show that even at what is taken to be this most primitive, automatic mechanical element of bodily functioning, you're already seeing behavior, which is to say meaningful responsiveness, something that's responding to a call, not something that is a mechanical reaction to a stimulus. In this section of the chapter, Merleau-Ponty goes through various examples, as he does throughout the whole book, to try to demonstrate that on the basis of experience and so on. I'm not going to go through all of those here, but I want to read you just the one part in this that I think is especially good. This is on page 9. And Merleau-Ponty says, again, he's drawing on various experiments and so on. He says, the sensory apparatus itself, as modern physiology imagines it, is no longer appropriate to the role of transmitter that it was made to play in classical science. Non-cortical lesions on tactile organs certainly dilute the concentration of points sensitive to heat, to cold, or to pressure, and also diminish the sensitivity of the points that remain. But if an extended enough sensation is applied to the damaged organ, detailed sensations reappear. A more energetic exploration by the hand compensates for the increased threshold. So basically he's saying, you have these experiments that show that it looks like, at some level you've lost your ability to sense, but the ability to get the kind of sensation you would have had your organ not been damaged comes with more time or with movement. If an extended enough stimulation is applied to the damaged organ, detailed sensations reappear, or a more energetic exploration by the hand compensates for the increased threshold. Right? So he says then, the next sentence is the key. At the elementary level of sensibility, we catch sight of a collaboration among partial stimuli and between the sensorial system and the motor system that, through a variable physiological constellation, keeps the sensation constant. Right? The basic point then that he wants to make there is that in these situations you're not seeing a kind of fixed determinate structure that gives a fixed determinate response to a fixed determinate stimulation. On the contrary, the stimulation that structurally seems to be imperfect, given enough time, seems to produce the sensation you were supposed to have on the model of the healthy organ, right? And so that's there you have partial stimuli giving you something more than the partiality that they would seem to be limited to. And then on the other hand, he says there's a collaboration of the sensory and the motor system, right? So that when the sensory surface isn't sufficient to be able to get what it's supposed to receive, well, you start moving. More energetic movement allows something to happen. So he's saying what you see there is not, a direct sort of stimulus and reaction. What you're seeing is a variety of resources, most obviously resources on the side of the perceiving body, sensory and motor. But interestingly also resources on the side of the object, right, partial stimuli. He's saying you're seeing resources that are kind of utilized by that activity of perception to get the result it was supposed to get if there hadn't been damage. Right? And so what that shows is that inherent to that whole structure is a kind of norm. There's something it's aiming for. And both from the side of the input and from the side of the response, which has multiple sides to it, resources are turned towards realizing that norm. And it's all of them sort of on their own are kind of inadequate. But they can bring it about that you have that normal sensation, even from these damaged the damaged body side, and in that sense, the damaged stimulus side. So the point there then is that, I guess there are 2 points. The body is in a way active in bringing about a result. It's not just being pushed and pulled around, right? It's doing something. And what it's doing something is, in a way, trying to realize a perceptual norm. There's a normative structure here of what is to be perceived. So what is going to be perceived isn't just a matter of something input. Rather, there's something, it's already defined that there is something to be perceived. And so what is input is being used, towards the realization of that norm. I guess I actually want to leave it there in terms of our discussion of the text. I really wanted to bring out that first analysis of indeterminacy, and then just to say something about the physiological background to those theories of sensation, and a quick account of Merleau-Ponty's critique of that. And I wanted to lead from that into saying something about the structure of the book. These things we've looked at so far, the critique of the notion of sensation and the related conception of the association of ideas, and then also the critique of the stimulus and reaction model of action, of behavior. Those things are basically what we would normally call empiricism. And these first 2 chapters, and actually part of the 3rd chapter, up to around where I quoted about attention, around page 34, up to there, that's all of the things Merleau-Ponty does are more or less criticisms of familiar kind of so-called empiricist interpretations of experience. It's kind of phenomenological critique of those things. And then the remainder of that chapter on attention, the chapter is actually attention and judgment, and the remainder of that is more or less about judgment, is more or less his criticism of what we commonly call rationalism. And I want just to say something about that. We often associate the words rationalism and empiricism with the great European philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries. I don't really think that's a great way to talk about those people. I think anytime you have these words, isms, empiricism, existentialism, and so on, you tend to make the mistake of imagining there's a set of doctrines that people are reproducing, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas on the contrary, the reason you read these people is because they're quite brilliant and quite individual. And while it seems to me that some of the stuff that commonly gets trotted out under the name of empiricism and rationalism has something to do with those figures, mostly it's a pretty misleading way to read them. On the other hand, there is a pretty powerful meaning in our world to these opposed notions of rationalism and empiricism. It's really to be sought in our everyday practices, our political ideas, our medical ideas, latest views in physics, economics, whatever. So the basic idea of empiricism is really that we're passive in experience, that our experience is the passive effect of some kind of cause. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about that at the level of physiology and seeing our putative action or behavior, not as action, but as something deterministically brought out from us by causal input. Therefore, it's passivity, it's not action, right? That's sort of robotic or mechanical. Or at the level of our perception and experience, where we see the state of our recognition of things again as a passive reaction to sensory input, something like that. Either at the level basically of mind or of body, empiricism is the interpretation of those dimensions of ourselves as passive. And so-called rationalism, what he refers to in this book as intellectualism, is more or less those same two things understood as active, right? Thinking of the meaningful world that we encounter as something we do, something the mind does. And again, thinking of our action as something that is a consequence of our will. Right? There is a really meaningful way in which empiricism and rationalism are contradictory, in that they are ways of interpreting our experience based on completely opposed notions, purely interpreting it passively, purely interpreting it actively. As I said, I don't think that that's a particularly helpful way to approach texts of the great philosophers like Hobbes or Descartes and so on. But it turns out to be really profoundly true if you read all kinds of people writing their essays about optics or digestion or whatever you like, and you will find many of those things documented throughout this book. So what Merleau-Ponty is really trying to do here, one of the things he's trying to do is to show the inadequacies of both rationalist and empiricist models of our experience. That opposition of passive and active is basically the same, as it turns out, as the dualism of mind and body, which is often associated with Descartes, but again, I think that's a pretty misleading way to think about Descartes. But that dualism, again, is super real. It comes up all over the place. And so the rationalism and empiricism, in the sense I'm talking about, are both dualistic. Like, they're both built upon that opposition, and then they kind of each choose a side. So Merleau-Ponty's book is a really rigorous critique of that dualism, basically. And what he tries to show as he goes through all these different phenomena of our experience is that we're constantly, in all of our practices, trying to understand ourselves by relying on these alternatives of rationalism and empiricism. And he's trying to show in all of these cases, like, those interpretations don't work. Right? We imagine ourselves just to be observing and describing, but what we're really doing is, foisting interpretations on, and faulty ones. And so his phenomenological analysis is really, by describing our experience, leading us to develop a new way of conceiving of experience and action, behavior, all of those things, that doesn't rely on those familiar oppositions. So that's kind of the form his book takes, right? Is he brings up things and you kind of see, well, we often think of it this way, and those will be sort of empiricist ways of interpreting it. Oh, but those things show there's a problem. Basically, an excessively passive interpretation eventually reveals, when we relate it to experience, that there's a certain kind of activity that hasn't been recognized. Oh, so then we have this overwhelmingly active interpretation. So he'll look at all the ways that we've developed effectively rationalist interpretations of this phenomenon. They will similarly be insufficient. But through going through those things, we ourselves actually develop a richer and richer phenomenological appreciation of our own experience. I wanted to mention that because I want to say that's the structure that you're going to see. I wanted to encourage you not to think of that particularly in relationship to the history of philosophy, but instead to try to relate it to our everyday ways of thinking. And I also want to bring out one thing about the history of philosophy that I think is unfortunate. Merleau-Ponty, like many others, commonly associates Kant to that way he's interpreting rationalism, and I think that's really unfortunate and quite wrong. So you will often find in Merleau-Ponty, and often in contemporary scholars who are influenced by Merleau-Ponty, a lot of claims being made about Kant that I think wouldn't stand up. And I mention that just because I think the things that Kant has to say are actually profoundly relevant to the things that Merleau-Ponty has to say. And so rather than turning you off that, this book should turn you onto that. If you're interested in that, I do have some other lectures on YouTube about Kant that might bring that out a bit. But I wanted to mention that because I want to encourage you not to use this book to underline whatever temptations you might have to say false, caricaturing things about the history of philosophy. So you really should learn about the meaningful difference between rationalism and empiricism and his meaningful critique of that. And you really shouldn't think that by doing that you're particularly talking about the history of philosophy. You should be looking at something else. Anyway, I'll leave it there. You can go on from here to the latter part of chapter 3 if you want to see then his engagement with chapter 3 of the introduction, if you want to see his engagement with rationalism, or you can go on to part 1 if you want to see him developing his own view, especially with respect to the body, which is a pretty direct follow-up to these things I was just saying about the reflex arc theory and so on. But anyway, yeah, I'll leave it there for now.